Yes, when I did the Dickens course, I did something on stereotypes, and we looked at stereotypes of Victorian women. And now we've got a fuller picture. We can see going right back to the 16th century, medieval period, even to see how women have been engaging with society and how women have been writing and contributing to literature and so on over the centuries. When I move in a little bit here to the Victorian period, we've got some background that we can relate this to. So I'd like to start with a 17th century writer, John Milton. I don't think he's come up very much in this course. He was a typical sort of chauvinist. He believed very much that women were inferior to men. And I'm hoping that you have heard his name, because for a long time he was considered to be second only to Shakespeare as a great writer in English. He was highly admired for a couple of hundred years, and in recent times his star has gone down a bit. People aren't quite so interested in epic poetry anymore, which was his genre. So he wrote the epic poem Paradise Lost. In that poem, he's trying to explain the story that goes before the Bible, or how God came to make this world. And he has, of course, the character of Adam, and Adam is presented to Eve, and Adam is told of Eve that she is thy likeness, your likeness. She is the image of you. She's similar to you. She is thy fit help, your suitable help, your other self, thy wish exactly to thy heart's desire. And that's just a little bit of what he says. There's a whole lot of stuff like this, basically saying, really, that the woman exists purely to please the man. She's there to fulfill your heart's desire. That's what she's for. And she's there to serve you, to help you. And this is very much how the Puritans saw women, and Milton was generally, broadly speaking, a Puritan, although he doesn't fit easily into any of the particular Puritan sects, but he's broadly speaking a Puritan, and he shares that kind of, well, prejudice, I suppose you'd have to call it, really. He shares that particular view of women. And Coventry Patmore, whose Angel in the House was written, it first came out in 1854, but he kind of kept adding to it and revising it and, doing things to it up until 1862. And he really is specifically referring back to Milton. He draws on Milton. He draws on Paradise Lost in his description of the perfect wife. Man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure. Women should get their kicks out of, knowing that they're making a man happy, that they're looking after a man, that's the whole basis of the angel in the house idea. All right, so it's not new, really, is it? It's going back to Milton. It's probably as old as the hills. This sort of negative thinking about women, or thinking of them as inferior, and thinking of them as there to serve man's pleasure, and that sort of thing. So, really, it's exactly what Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, was complaining about in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that women, Rousseau said, should be educated so as to please men. So it's exactly the same idea. We've already, long before, Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, is writing at the end of the 18th century. This poem came out in the middle of the 19th century, so half a century before we'd had women speaking out against this way of thinking. And as I said, even Mary Wollstonecraft isn't saying anything particularly new. Most of what she says can be found in Mary Astell 100 years before that. So it's not, really, Coventry Patmore isn't saying anything particularly new here. Somehow or other, though, he this angel in the house image, this stereotype, tends to be the first thing that comes into a lot of people's minds when they think about Victorian women. They think, oh, Victorian women, oh yeah, the angel in the house. Okay, it's sort of a set connection in people's minds. But I don't know, about you, but if you, whoever you are anything at all like me, whoever I am, then you probably have heard enough about Coventry Patmore's poem, The Angel in the House, to drive you crazy. I mean, I just hear it so often. Angel in the house, angel in the house. Angel. And that's all the Victorian. They're all angels in the house. Yes, that's it. Come on. It can't be that simple. All right? So I want to try to get behind this stereotype. I mean, yes, he did. He wrote the poem Angel in the House, sure. But I don't know why people keep going on about it. It is, after all, a very bad poem. I mean, it's bad to the extent that even the people who talk about the angel in the house probably couldn't recite a line of the contents. You say, oh, angel in the house, oh yeah, tell me about the poem, tell me, quote it to me. Oh, I haven't read it. Well, of course you haven't read it, it's a load of rubbish. Okay, it's not a good poem, all right? But somehow or other, that the title of that poem, The Angel in the House, has become the kind of byword for the Victorian woman. Well, I think it's time we moved on from that. Of course, yes, we know that Victorian women were supposed to play an idealized role in the domestic sphere, in the house, inside, as wives, basically. Yeah, okay, fine, okay, we got that. Let's move on and just think a little bit more about what else is going on, because certainly that doesn't cover the whole situation. I mean, there's some truth in it. I mean, it's a stereotype, and some women would have tried to live up to it as a model of behaviour. But stereotypes can be positive because they can sometimes, Japanese people tend to like rice. It's a stereotype, okay? But, it can block us from seeing other things, like how many people in this room had toast for breakfast today and not asagohan, didn't have rice for breakfast, even though you're Japanese. Okay, so stereotypes can obscure the truth as often as they reveal it. I'm going to take a look at the census of 1851. At that time, the population of the United Kingdom was rather less than half of what it is today. It was 27.5 million people, and of course. Well, actually, more than half of those were women. As we'll see, the population of women was higher than that of men. And out of those women, how many of them do you think are going to be angels in the house? I mean, obviously some of them are going to be children and stuff, and I'm not talking about them, but just looking at adult women, let's just get a little bit closer to the reality of what was going on. The census of 1851. Now, every 10 years there was going to be a census, all through the Victorian period, all through the 19th century, and the census of 1851 seems a good one. Another big area that needs to be thought about is prostitution. Prostitution was huge in the Victorian period. I mean, we know about it through writers like Dickens. He goes on about it quite a lot, but so do other writers. But if we actually look at some of the written work on the subject, we've got things like O'Daniel's Ins and Outs of London, which came out again sort of around about the middle of the 19th century. His estimate was that there were about 55,000 prostitutes in London. And that's out of a population of 2.2 million. Do the maths. One prostitute for every 40 people. Wow. Okay, some of whom would be children, some of whom would be women. So you're talking about, what would that work out at? About 1 prostitute for every 15 adult males? Something like that? Okay? That is an incredibly high number. William Acton put the figure much lower. He reckoned it was around 8,000, but most scholars think O'Daniel got it right and that Acton got it wrong. Of course, it's a slightly grey area because a lot of women weren't going to go around shouting, "Hey, I'm a prostitute." Okay, so Acton was just going on this sort of officially known number, whereas O'Daniel is looking at the actual reality behind the officially recognised number. And there's another estimate, the Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was formed in Victorian times, which figured that it was even more than O'Daniel reckons. They put it at about 80,000. Okay, so they're estimating an even higher number than O'Daniel does. Well, whatever the exact figures are, it's pretty clear that there was a huge amount of prostitution going on in Victorian England. There was sort of institutionalized prostitution going on because members of the armed forces, the Navy, the Army, either they couldn't marry, depending on their rank, or they were discouraged from marrying. And you're supposed to give your life to serving your country as a soldier. And so what's the main sexual outlet? I mean, what are they going to do? Okay? And other areas that you might not initially think of, like people like me, university professors. 150, 200 years ago, very few university professors or university teachers were married. Okay, they were supposed to live like monks or something. And again, a lot of clergymen were in the same position. They were discouraged from marrying, and they would give their lives to looking after their flock, their people of the parish, and looking after the poor and so on. That's what they were supposed to do. So I don't know, the exact figures, but it seems to have been pretty much an accepted feature of Victorian life that a lot of people, even married men, would visit prostitutes. It wasn't illegal as such, and the whole ethos was that a respectable woman wasn't supposed to regard, sexual intercourse as being enjoyable. So having sex with your wife was considered to be a very boring, and probably was very often a very boring experience. So if men wanted kicks, they would go out and find a prostitute. It's the trouble with the Victorian period is that it's so indirect. You don't get people like if it's the 17th century, people sort of say, yes, my friends and I, we got together and we went out and first we got drunk and then we went to visit a load of prostitutes. And quite a lot of records of people doing that in the 17th century. By the time you get to the 18th century, people are getting a little bit less kind of keen on talking about it. By the time you get to the 19th century, they almost never say. Or they sex. Oh yes, there's a male sex, isn't there? Well, actually, they didn't have the word sex in the way that we use it, but you know what I mean. They wouldn't talk about it. Okay, not very often. But actually, when I was about your age, there was a book that came out called The Other Victorians, and you might want to check that. The Other Victorians, and that was kind of quite a shocking read when we were your kind of age. At university, the Victorians were not like we'd been taught at school. All right, so you might be interested in taking a look at that. It was a sort of watershed publication at the time. So, how did people look at prostitutes? Well, in their written comments about prostitutes, they sort of seem to be in between, condemning them, these are fallen women, these are bad people and something, and feeling sorry for them. Dickens, as an example, gives them very often a bad end, but then in real life, He did significant work for prostitutes, tried to reform prostitutes. There's some question of what exactly why he was so interested in prostitutes, and I think it's probable that Dickens was one of those men who did go off and visit prostitutes, but he didn't feel that they were inherently bad people, and he felt that if they, society should give them a chance to reform, and as the Victorian period goes on, there are more and more institutions that are set up to help prostitutes to reform and get back into respectable life in society. But again, obviously, they are a long way from being the angel in the house. And then you've got the so-called surplus women. Well, you had the whole problem of the surplus population in general going on. There were about 4% more women than men, according to the 1851 census. So there were hundreds of thousands of surplus women who were, statistically going to be unable to find a husband. They just wouldn't be able to because there weren't enough men around. One of the reasons would be that men would emigrate and go and live abroad more often than women did. And if things got tough for you as a man, if you committed a crime, you were probably going to be sent abroad anyway as a prisoner to one of the prison colonies. But this is the time of the British Empire. This is a time of opportunity. Men can go off and make fortunes, abroad. And so if things aren't working out too well at home, quite often people would go abroad. Women did as well, but some of those places were quite rough environments, not very suitable for women. So it would be men who would go and risk themselves in those tougher environments. So there were more men who were doing that. Of course, there were wars going on, as there had been in the 18th century, and men were being killed in conflicts. So for various reasons, the population of women was higher than that of men. And 30% of women over 20 were unmarried. And those who were married, of course, they were legally subordinate to their husbands. They had to obey their husbands. 30% seems very high, but again, if you remember what we said before, there were quite large numbers of men who were not expected to marry as well. Okay, soldiers, clergymen, that sort of thing. Being without a husband can be a miserable humiliation, because you're kind of, especially if you don't have any income of your own, you're kind of treated as very much a second or third class member of society. You're tolerated, but you're not welcome in very many places. So that would be a difficult position to be in, especially if you, as I say, if you were poor. But having a husband could actually be worse, because a husband had complete control over his wife. Her money belonged to him once they got married, at least in the earlier part of the century. We'll look at how things changed during the course of the century in a little while. But their possessions would become their husbands. Legally, they themselves became their husband's possession. The woman did not have any independent identity in law. Women could scarcely ever get a divorce, even when their husbands were cruel or unfaithful. And the woman herself actually legally belonged to the husband. So that, for example, if a crime was committed against a woman who was married, it would be her husband who would have to take the court case. Would have to take it to the police or take it to court. If she wasn't married and she had a father or brother, it would be the father or brother to do it. If she was unmarried and had she was not dependent on any male, then she'd have to do it herself. But as I say, she'd be regarded as a kind of second-class member of society. Basically, the idea was that every woman belongs to a man. And we talked about that a little bit, going on in the 18th century, didn't we? In the later 18th century, when we were looking at the epistolary novel, and we looked at Fanny Burney, how a woman goes out on her own, or unaccompanied by a man, and she immediately kind of gets jumped on by predatory males. Um, so a married woman would be under the control of her husband, and an unmarried woman would be under the control of fathers or brothers. But still, you've got a steady growth going on of independent women, single women, working women, women who've gained an inheritance in some way, ladies of the night, that is, prostitutes. Various kinds of women were demonstrating themselves to be quite independent of men. So that as the century progresses, the independent woman becomes a more common feature of society. And this whole idea of surplus women goes back to Robert Malthus, which is a very important work if you're interested in the Victorian way of thinking about society, because his essay on the principle of population had the idea that in the natural way of things, naturally, there will always be too many people born. And that nature, in its natural way, will kill them off through diseases or hunger or earthquakes or various natural disasters, and that we should just let that happen. It's kind of shogunai. It's nature's way of sorting out a problem. That there are surplus human beings, unnecessary, too many of them. Okay, this was kind of very much a part of the Victorian policy in terms of their social management. The idea that you just have to let nature sort itself out here. I know you feel bad about it. You don't want to see people dying of starvation or something, but you know, if you just leave them, they're just going to breed. Look at rabbits. You know, you start with 2 rabbits, 6 months later you got 200, 3 years later you got 20,000. You know, you can't just let it happen like that. Nature has its way of sorting that out. Just let it happen. Laissez-faire. Just let it be. And the same policy extended to economics. Just let the market work things out. If that means that some people haven't got money to buy things and they die, well, you know, don't worry about it. That's just the way it's supposed to be. Okay? So that's the kind of way of thinking that's going on, especially in the earlier part of the century, but it carries on right through the century. This supposed so-called laissez-faire attitude. So, okay. I think so far we've made it clear that the angel of the house was more likely to exist in the heads of Victorian men rather than in their actual houses. She was something that they could imagine and think about, but they weren't going to meet her all that frequently. Of course, there would be some. And it's also obvious that there were lots of different kinds of women in Victorian society, in the domestic sphere, in the home, and in the public sphere. So we need to get to understand all these different types of women and different ways of living, different circumstances of their lives. They don't all fit into a particular stereotype. And the other thing that we need to think about is that changes in attitudes are going on all through the century. The 19th century is not static. It doesn't end the way it begins. When people say Victorian England was like this, wow, you can't say that. I mean, I have actually, I'm sorry, I have a little bit said that, haven't I? I said, you know, a woman was the property of her husband, but that changed, even inside Victorian times. So what I said would apply to the earlier part of Victorian times, but it was changing by the time you got to the sort of 1880s and you know, the later part of the century. So you need to be very, very careful when you talk about conditions in Victorian England. You need to check your history. It's happened so many times. Students are writing about a particular 19th century text, and they say, of course, in the Victorian period, nanika, nanika, nanika. And I say, that law was changed 20 years before this book was published. Okay? Or, you know, that was the condition, you know, at a different part of the century. It wasn't the condition at the time that that particular book was written. So you really need to be very careful about that, and think about how things were changing over the course of the century. So it's called a century of peace. It wasn't really a century of peace, but it was a century of peace at home for people. Basically, it was relatively peaceful because war was going on in distant places, but nothing threatening. If you remember, in the earlier part of the 19th century, there was Napoleon, and that was a direct threat that he would actually attack Britain. And during its 18th century empire-building history, big wars going on all the time, taking large numbers of people, and the sense that the society, the whole country was at war, more or less goes on all through that 18th century. And I said that was one reason why you don't really get much social reform going on. If people are too busy killing each other and exploiting each other because of the Industrial Revolution, you don't get much reform. But the Victorian period is a period of reform. Things are changing, partly because it was a time of peace. And if there's one lesson to learn about this, your lives have been lived in a time of peace. And think how much society has changed in Japan since 1945 and now. Okay, an awful lot has changed. If you actually go through listing all the reforms for Japan, you're going to say, wow, I never realized. But if you look at it, times of peace are generally times of social reform. Okay, and times of war, social reform breaks down. People have to put human rights second. The first thing is survival of the country, or at least that's the paradigm. And the other side is that if reform's happening in a general sense, then of course some of those reforms are going to, relate to women. They're going to be reforms for legal reforms relating to women's position in society. So Britain's, at this stage, the number one world power. It gets overtaken by America economically during the later part of the century, but it's the major economic power, it's the major political power, it's got a huge empire all over the world, and it didn't have to face any threats to its home. So people could feel very confident in their sort of British identity at that stage. They'd be putting down rebellions in the colonies, in the Shokuminchi, but nothing at home. And for people at home, life was basically peaceful and stable. And another thing that kept the engine of reform turning was the shadow of the French Revolution. People were thinking, we don't want that to happen here. I mean, when I say people, some people wanted it to happen here. The lower class might have wanted a revolution, but I mean the people in power. So that gave them a strong motivation to put reforms in place. So there's something a bit weird going on with the... oh, dear. Oh, I see. Something wrong with the... yeah, so it's going to create an atmosphere favourable to reform. And obviously that's going to include the reform of women's rights. So basically the upper class, the controlling elite, is saying, hey, look, the people want something. They want some reform. They want this much. Oh, well, don't give them this much. Give them this much. Keep them from actually killing us. Keep them from actually turning violent. Give them something. They'll be back next year for more. Okay, but this year that's what we'll give them. And then next year we'll give them a bit more. But that goes on for 100 years, and you start to see some really big changes coming along. All right, so that's what I want to get across here. Women's position, okay, they didn't get the vote in the Victorian period. That didn't come along until the 1920s, quite late comparatively. But an awful lot of other rights were gained during this period. So I'm going to go through that now, and that's going to be the end of this presentation, just sort of go through these reforms. I notice one or two people still scribbling, so I'll give you a minute or two to write in whatever. And then I'll just go through the century, showing you how reforms worked. And it's colour-coded, so you'll be able to see, you know, how it plays out in terms of women. But there were lots and lots of changes going on at this time. Whereas in the 18th century, laws were very often passed in a negative way against the people, we saw the Enclosures Acts, for example, depriving people of their rights, taking away their, things like the common land. And even as late as 1799, you get the Act to Prevent Unlawful Combinations of Workmen. What that basically means is, if the conditions in your factory are really bad, where people are possibly dying because the machinery is so dangerous, and you get together with other workmen to try to improve your conditions, that's illegal. You may not have any kind of worker organization, what we call kumiai, unions. Totally illegal. 1799. We exploit you, and you can't even get together to complain about it or protest about it. If you even try, we'll put you in prison. So that's the kind of 18th century. The tenor of the laws is very often against the ordinary person. But once you get into the 19th century, things start improving. It's basically a time in which the lives of the ordinary people improve. To be honest, beyond recognition, really. It's just when I've gone through this and you look back on it, you'll realise just what a tremendous watershed the Victorian period was. So I think we're just about ready to begin this now. Let's take a look at it. I'm taking you through the 19th century, showing you, I haven't got every reform in here, okay, but I've got quite a lot of the reforms. We'd start with the Factory Act of 1802. Apprentices, people who are younger people who are joining the factory, they're not allowed to work more than 12 hours a day. I said, 12 hours? That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But it's better than 15, isn't it? It's better than no limit. Okay, it's better than people working 18 hours a day and not getting enough sleep and dying. Okay, so the limit was 12 hours a day. 1807, slavery, not slavery, but the buying and selling of slaves is made illegal. Okay? Slavery takes longer for it to be abolished, but the Slave Act abolishes buying and selling slaves. 1811, you start to have a national society for the education of the poor. Okay, people actually taking it on themselves as this is a responsibility. It's society's responsibility. We should be doing something about it. And that's followed by the British and Foreign School Society in 1814. Having these two different societies didn't actually help British education in some ways, because one of them, the first one, the National Society for the Education of the Poor, was basically religious based. Education should come from the church. Whereas the British and Foreign School Society was multi-denominational. It had Jewish people, it had Catholic people, it had a whole range of religious belief, and they felt that education should be basically education, and religion should be separate. And the kind of arguments that went on between these two groups actually held up the development of a state education system. So Britain was comparatively late in having a state education system because these two couldn't agree with each other. But still, there are two types of reform in the positive direction. Workers in mines in 1816 start to have safety lamps. In 1819, children under 9 may no longer work in factories. Okay? Small children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5 years old, were working in factories up until this time. That became illegal. Then in 1823, the Anti-Slavery Society is formed. Again, a group of people saying, we actually, it's not enough just to stop the slave trade. Existing slaves need to be set free. Their children need to be set free. We need to do something about that. 1824, 25 years after that nasty act of 1799, trade unions, kumiai, are made legal after a scandalous case in which a group of workers were sent off to Australia just for trying to improve their working conditions. The whole country was angry about it, and the law had to be changed. In the late 1820s, religious restrictions. Up until now, if you were a Catholic, for example, you were limited in what you could do in society. Most of those restrictions were lifted for Catholics, for Jewish people, for people of other religions or other denominations of Christianity. Most of the discrimination against them was made illegal. 1831, now it's people under the age of 21 may not work at night. Okay, shift work. 1832, middle-class men get the right to vote. Until now, the number of people who had the right to vote was very small, and politicians could influence them easily. So giving large numbers of people the right to vote ensured that democracy would work more effectively. What happened there? I think something went wrong there. I don't know what that one was. It seemed to go behind. Oh, no, something's gone wrong there. Slave trade is abolished, but I can't. No, I don't know. Something seemed to come up behind something. I can't see what it was. I missed it. And then you've got the one. I put it in red because it's the one clearly negative reform, which is the new Poor Law, or the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834. This is the one that Charles Dickens is famous for criticising. It's the one that led to a lot of suffering among poor people who had no choice but to go to the workhouse, where conditions were sometimes so bad that they would die in the workhouse, or else just to die on the streets, or live as best they could on the streets. So I put that one in. I've colour-coded that one, and you may notice that so far none of these reforms particularly involves women. But things are going to change fairly soon. The Anti-Corn Law League is formed in 1838. Until now, you've had what's called protectionism in the market, keeping the price of corn artificially high, because that's good for the British landowners. They have large amounts of agricultural land. They're growing the food. They don't want cheap food to come in from Europe, so they're keeping the prices high. All through this early Victorian period, if you read the novels, people are hungry. People are hungry. Food is hard to get. Lots of people just exist on bread and cheese and water. Okay, on Sunday they might get a bit of meat. All right, people were frequently hungry in this early Victorian period because food prices were kept artificially high. The Anti-Corn Law League was campaigning for lower food prices. And now we get the first act that specifically targets women, and it gives mothers limited rights to their children in cases of divorce or separation. You see, previously, if you divorced, divorce was very difficult to obtain, but it did sometimes happen, or if you separated, which is more often happened, your husband would gain control of the children. You had no legal right to your own children. And so the 1839 Child Custody Act started to give women some chance of having custody, of being able to have access to their own children or to look after their children rather than the father in cases like that. Then we get, oh sorry, I've put this, there's a mistake there, that should be changed. So what have we got next? 1839, local police forces are established. Up until now, there hasn't been a proper police force, and if a crime was committed against you, you just had to get your friends together, or you had to try and get local people to support you. It was up to you to catch whoever had done, stolen your goods, and then take them to court. There wasn't a properly established police force to do that. And then in 1842, you get another law that targets women and makes it illegal for women to work underground in coal mines. There weren't all that many women working as coal miners, but they were no longer allowed to work underground. Underground was particularly harsh, and they're the same for children. Until 1842, children were working underground. Then the Corn Laws, finally, there's success, okay? From 1838, they'd been lobbying, and in 1846, 8 years later, they got rid of those corn laws that were keeping the food prices artificially high. And then after this, we see women's reforms coming in thick and fast. First, we get the Queen's College for Women, which is the first college that actually gives women an education that could be compared with a man's education. We get the first public library in 1852, down the bottom there. And Florence Nightingale, a very famous nursing figure, she develops hospitals. There's a war going on in Europe, in Crimea, sort of over towards Russia, that sort of Europe's eastern border with Russia. And she does spectacular work looking after the wounded soldiers, and hospitals, nursing facilities start to develop because of her. And okay, completely different topic, but in 1858 the first swimming pool for women was opened. Men could go swimming in towns, but women couldn't until 1858. Model housing, low-cost accommodation for working-class people, that starts in the 1860s. And now, the first doctor, the first woman doctor, 1865, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. The Nightingale School of Nursing in 1860. Sorry, that's out of time sequence. Girls admitted to Cambridge local examinations, 1865. I've got her already. Sorry, she's in there twice. She shouldn't be. Women's Suffrage Committee. Suffrage is basically, it just means the right to vote. So the first kind of lobbying for giving women the right to vote comes in 1865. The Women's Suffrage Committee. And in 1867, a bill is presented to Parliament. It isn't passed, it isn't accepted. Women don't get the right to vote, as I said, at this time. but a bill is presented to Parliament on the subject of women's right to vote. Josephine Butler in 1867 opens the first industrial home for former prostitutes. Okay? As I said, giving reform places for prostitutes to reform and get back into society is something that developed strongly in the later part of the 19th century. The first Married Women's Property Act. This gives women right to continue to own their property after they marry. There are several acts because it happens in several different stages. The first one basically gives them the right, money that they inherit after marrying or money that they earn after marrying belongs to them. You've got the Elementary Education Act. I haven't put a date, 1870. Infant Custody Act, basically turning the balance so that it's normally going to be the woman who gets custody of the child, 1872, rather than the man. London Medical College for Women, 1874. Women admitted to degree courses at London University, 1878. Okay, women can... ironically, they were allowed to attend the degree courses. I'm not sure they weren't allowed to take the degree. They could follow the course, but they couldn't take the actual degree until later on. But women who are abused are allowed to separate from their husband, 1878. Until then, if you were abused, you had no escape from an abusive husband. 1880, education becomes compulsory between the ages of 7 and 10. Second Married Women's Property Act, 1882. This gives even property that a woman brings before the marriage, it can also continue to belong to her. 1884, voting rights are extended to most adult males, but of course still not to women. 1889, school leaving age is raised to 12, and I think there's nothing that really expresses the changes that took place in the 19th century so clearly as this. At the beginning of the century, children, there was no limit to how young they were. They could still be in nappies. They could be 3 or 4 years old. There was no law to stop them being put to work. And they were, okay? Sometimes very small children were sent in when the machinery broke in the factories because they could get in there and they could get the stuff. Very often, once the machinery started moving again, it would move and it would kill the child. Okay? Bad luck. And 100 years later, less than 100 years later, all children under the age of 12 are supposed to be in school. What could be a bigger change than that? Okay? The changes are radical. But the changes for women, as you can see from all this green here, all right, there, all the reforms for women, that's also radical. Okay? 1893, free schools are created for blind and deaf children. Last one that I've got here, 1898, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, okay, where the lobbying for women to get the vote. This is basically what we call second wave feminism, the lobbying to get the vote. So the first wave feminism is mostly focused on education. Second wave was focused on the vote. All right, and that's getting underway at the end of the century. The end of the 19th century. Okay, I did mean to add a little bit of a sort of conclusion at the end of this, but I didn't have time, so there isn't a conclusion. But I think you can see the point here. You can see that the tremendous change in the position of poor people, children, women over the course of the 19th century. It's a huge development. Okay, so there we go.